Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 17 of season 3 of Babylon 5, War Without End, part the second. Recap. Then we discover Sheridan is witnessing events 17 years on from the Shadow War as the aged Malari begins to cough. He says he is tired, but tells Sheridan to make peace with his gods as he sends him back to his cell because the next time he sees him, Sheridan will meet them shortly thereafter. On Babylon 4, we see the commander from Babylon Squared order an investigation into the recent explosion in space and double patrols inside the station in case anyone tries to breach the hull. Too late, of course, but as Ivanova and Marcus move through the station, Marcus suddenly vanishes just as Ivanova is confronted by two members of her aforementioned patrols. Of course, Marcus hasn't gone far, and the two make short work of the patrol, Marcus having anticipated that as luck isn't something he believes in, that would be the worst time to encounter a patrol, so he got himself ready. Ironically, his pike then knocks open exactly the sort of wall panel Ivanova was hoping to find. How lucky. Sheridan blips out of his cell on Centauri Prime, and back to the present briefly, dropping his time stabilizer in sight of Zathras. He fades out again, and as Sinclair and Delenn position themselves to act, Delenn comments that she's had a feeling like someone walking over her grave, as the humans would say. John blinks back to Centauri Prime, where an older Delenn is thrown in with him. She says they tried to get information from her, but could get nothing, knowing that they have allowed them this time together. She reassures him that their son is safe, and says she loves him, all of which confuses past Sheridan, of course, not to mention this viewer. Ivanova succeeds in faking a hull breach that encourages the workers on Babylon 4 to abandon their posts and closes pressure doors so that they can move the equipment they need without interference. In the cell on Centauri Prime, Sheridan explains to Delenn that he isn't who he appears to be, and she recognises that what he once told her has in fact come to pass, that his eyes do not carry the burden of what has befallen him since those days. She confirms that they won the war they set out to fight, but the foes change and the war continues, and the cost of the victory was great in personal terms. But yes, they have a son called David. It's another classic piece of acting from both of them. Guards retrieve them. It seems that Londo is being controlled by what he refers to as his keeper, but by drinking just the right amount he can put it to sleep and regain his freedom, but for increasingly shorter periods of time. It doesn't care why he does things so long as the results are what it wants. And right now, it wants Delenn and Sheridan dead. Malari says that they are his last chance for redemption and urges them to free his world with their allies in exchange for his saving them now, telling them there is a ship behind the palace that his guards will take them to. But they must hurry, his keeper is recovering. As the guard takes them, an older Jakar, one eye covered in a strap, steps out from behind the throne, and Londo notes that when his keeper awakens it will alert the others, and he will be dead not long after, as they are not fans of betrayal. So he bids Jakar end things between them, saying he is as tired of his life as Jakar is. As Jakar begins to strangle him to buy Delenn and Sheridan time, Londo's keeper awakens and forces him to fight back. Sheridan feels himself being pulled back to Babylon 4 again, and Delenn urges him to treasure the moments he has before that time passes. Finally, she tells him not to go to Zahadum. Then he's gone. In the throne room, Londo and Jakar lie on the floor, the Emperor's seal lying on the ground. A figure picks it up. It's Vir. So by prophecy, he will be Emperor in the future. Last Centauri standing. On the station, Zathras declines to help Ivanova and Marcus as he is busy tinkering with a blue spacesuit. As he bounces around, Marcus says he's quite mad because he thinks Sheridan is going to materialise in the suit whose power is being fed into the time stabilizer. As the lightning effect starts to ripple over the empty suit and it starts to fill out, Ivanova and Marcus discuss Valen, the great Minbari leader, who was said to have come to the Minbari 1,000 years ago, and Marcus says it would be a great honour to meet him before Ivanova spots the suit and runs to it. Zathras pops his head back out of the hull breach and says, "No one ever listens to Zathras. Quite mad, they say." It is indeed Sheridan, and Sinclair joins them, both now wearing blue spacesuits as they need to EVA to attach the equipment to the power core. Delenn also joins them, and Sheridan obviously wants to speak to her but realises time is short. Their work complete, Ivanova is about to issue a false alert to encourage Babylon 4's evacuation when its commander orders power output increased to compensate for the drain the time device is causing. The resultant surge knocking Sheridan out of sync again and throwing Sinclair backwards in 0G. As Zathras works feverishly aboard the White Star to stabilise the situation, Babylon 4 blinks into the time warp and returns to normal space as Zathras regains control of its travel. The command crew of the station is convinced that evacuation is now needed and sends out a distress signal, and based on Zathras' determination of the year, it's 2 years ago, which means the events of Babylon Squared are about to play out for the first time, from a certain point of view. As the time system is now finally balanced, they need to recalibrate it and experience time flashes as tachyon levels spike. Delenn appearing in what seems to be a Babylon 5 crew quarter, with John asleep, picking up a snow globe before the door opens and a woman speaks, causing Delenn to drop the globe. She returns to the present to discover that Sinclair has aged significantly owing to his earlier unprotected exposure to the time field in Babylon Squared. Zathras confirms he is likely to age further as he approaches their time, and this possibility is what made Sinclair keep Garibaldi out of the situation. He asks whether Sheridan's time stabilizer can be repaired, and Zathras confirms he has the parts but needs tools. Ivanova takes him to a work area she saw earlier, while Sinclair prepares to re-enter the power core. Zathras struggles to find the right tool, puzzled as to why Ivanova says they're running out of time when time is infinite. Lanier alerts Sinclair to incoming ships, and he responds that it's him, and Garibaldi, arriving to evacuate Babylon 4 2 years ago. Lanier and Marcus exchange looks at that one. Zathras is still hunting for the right tool and seems to complete his work just as he is found by station security. Sheridan shimmers in again near the White Star, and Delenn sees him and seems to have something in mind. Marcus tells Ivanova the time system will take 2 hours to repair, but she knows that's too long and notes Zathras' capture. She intends to get to CNC and work on the problem from that end. The events then dovetail into Babylon Squared, with Zathras being questioned by the younger Sinclair, interspersed with Ivanova making it onto a now deserted CNC to regulate the power flow to the time system. A blue-suited figure appears on the main corridor, and in the confusion from Sinclair trying to help it, Zathras is able to pass it the repaired time stabilizer and it vanishes just as it did in Babylon Squared originally. This continues up until the point the last shuttles leave the station, with Zathras pinned and telling the younger Sinclair he needs to leave because he has a destiny. Marcus finds a dazed Sheridan who has an undamaged stabilizer, which prompts Marcus to wonder who's running around in a blue suit. The older Sinclair stands outside the station trying to contact Garibaldi to warn him to watch his back, but his shuttle is out of comms range. A suited figure approaches Zathras, but it's Delenn in the suit, not Sinclair. Sinclair then comes in from his EVA as the station moves through time again and meets an unsuited Delenn, who says the lines we heard her say in Babylon Squared, but from an angle where we can now see her, of course. Seeing her with hair then would have been a rather major spoiler at the time. On the CNC of Babylon 4, Ivanova has made the time system largely automated, but Marcus has realised it's still going to need somebody to go back with the station and volunteers to do so. Sinclair steps in and says he will take it back, because he's always taken it back. If he were to go back to the present, it would probably kill him anyway. As proof, he offers a note from 900 years ago in his own handwriting that prompted his return to Babylon 5 to set these events in motion, with Delenn confirming receipt of her own note from him. Ivanova is upset, but Sinclair is calm because this is what his life has always been pointed to. He asks Ivanova and Marcus to give them a moment, then asks Zathras why he called them all the One at various points when he said he followed the One. Zathras explains he is 110 years old, the oldest caretaker of the Great Machine. He knows things even Draal doesn't know yet, and he knows that Sinclair, Delenn, and Sheridan. He describes Minbari culture: 3 castes, worker, warrior, religious; 3 languages, light, dark, grey. The Grey Council, 3 times 3. All is 3, as they are 3, as they are one, as they are the One. Sinclair is the one who was, Delenn the one that is, Sheridan the one that will be. Zathras will stay with the one that was. They have a destiny. Sheridan and Sinclair shake hands. Sinclair and Delenn offer the Minbari farewell with hands raised towards each other. Sheridan and Delenn return to the White Star, with Sheridan saying it's what Sinclair wanted so they'll respect it, and they burn back through the rift with its ceiling behind them. Delenn agrees that door is now shut, and is not the only one. Sheridan was told that 1,000 years ago Minbari souls started being born into human bodies. Delen's transformation was triggered using a machine the Minbari found 1,000 years ago with a view to balancing that door. She goes on to explain that her people would never have accepted Babylon 4 if it had been brought to them by a human. It clicks for Marcus. A Minbari not born of Minbari. And now we see the aged Sinclair mirroring Delen's activation of that machine to prepare his own chrysalis, flashing back to Soul Hunter and Legacies, where Delen says they, being the Great Council, were right about him, and in Legacies where Neroon says he speaks like a Minbari. And so 1,000 years ago, Babylon 4 arrives, and old-style Minbari war cruisers approach it with a Vorlon cruiser parked next to it. Zathras ushers 2 Minbari on board onto the main corridor, where 2 Vorlons float outside their encounter suits, with an unfamiliar Minbari standing between them. Sinclair, his transformation complete, now known as Valen, offering the station as a gift, with much work to be done. I'm not crying, you're crying. Hush now. So concludes this 2-parter, which spans 1,017 years, give or take. Impressive, isn't it? So, where do we even begin? Let's try chronologically, that seems appropriate. In 1000 BB5, before Babylon 5, the Minbari need a new base of operations. Babylon 4 drops in to fill the void and support the war effort, allowing the Alliance to inflict a heavy loss on the Shadows. On board is a 110-year-old something called Zathras, caretaker of the Great Machine, or formerly the caretaker of the Great Machine on Epsilon 3, which I don't think exists at this point. Maybe 500 years too early? A piece of equipment from Epsilon 3 was used to change Sinclair into Valen, which then passes back up the timeline to be used by Delen 1001 years later. 100 years after arriving in the past, Valen writes notes to one Geoffrey Sinclair and Delen to be opened in 900 years. This after he has established what can be considered modern Minbari society and established a prophecy that will shape future events with the support of the Vorlons. So, as the Vorlons said in the first of these 2 episodes, Sinclair is the closed circle, going back to the past to ensure the future is born that sends him back to the past. Classic predestination paradox, perhaps? Perhaps. For those having watched Season 1, much of this makes perfect sense, because Sinclair was always seemingly handpicked by the Minbari, and spiritual by his nature, despite being a warrior as well. He actually encapsulates many of the caste traits Minbari culture is built around. Whilst we knew he had a Minbari soul, this is where it gets interesting, because that means he's always had Valen's soul. But did Valen's soul come from his transformation, and he was then born with it in an inherited sense? Or was his soul always human, so the Triluminaries immediately detected what they thought were Minbari souls in humans once they started scanning humans? Or is he somewhere in the middle? Interesting one, isn't it? I suspect the Vorlons probably helped with this side of things, because they'd understand the temporal situation when Sinclair had explained it to them, as logically he would have had to get them on side for the presentation of Babylon 4. That also leads to the question of whether the Vorlons were behind Epsilon 3's creation in order to ensure how events worked out. The other interesting aspect of this is that once we move beyond War Without End, the Vorlons no longer have any future knowledge that might have been given to them by Sinclair. Indeed, it's unclear just how much he might have felt was sensible to give them, or how much they might have felt they needed. Perhaps he tipped himself off on this one. Incidentally, the encounter suits being used by the Vorlons on Babylon 4 are of the same type, so it's hard to know whether the Vorlons themselves might be, for example, one of the ones that we saw on Minbar in the first episode of this 2-parter. Also, shout out to the longer-bodied old-school Minbari war cruisers. Nice that they went to the trouble of using a new model for that era, although it is obviously an earlier version of the modern war cruiser. What's also crazy here is that in the last few moments of this Season 3 episode, we see callbacks to three, get it, Season 1 episodes, Soul Hunter, Legacies and Chrysalis. Through the reuse of actual footage from those episodes, jigsaw pieces falling into place 2 years later in Showtime. So bloody clever. Alright, so that's the past established, and the comics expanded on some of what Valen got up to, as did the books, I believe. because there's a whole different war to be looked at there if one cared to, totally removed from Babylon 5, plus a whole lot of racial engineering that he's going to do. So, 2254. Ivanova et al. Play hide and seek on Babylon 4 to establish the time-shifting mechanism, and at various points Sheridan joins them from the future, having been knocked out of sync in the first episode of the two-parter. It's nice to see that while these are redressed sets with different lighting and so on, lots of the posters and screen displays show Babylon 4 rather than Babylon 5. Would have been an easy thing to mess up. I can't say I was looking, but subconsciously I probably was, and nothing jumped out at me as being wrong. Some nice touches here as we discover why Babylon 4 lurched forwards in time rather than just going back smoothly, also establishing why Sinclair looks so much older in the suit in Babylon Squared. We then jump forwards to 2258, 2 years before present time, and smack into the events of Babylon Squared from Season 1, which are literally replayed here for a few minutes. So if you saw the original episode, you can bounce up and down excitedly, knowing what's been done, whereas if you're new, you can just go, oh okay, I see why Sinclair warned him about that when Zathras is getting interrogated. Again, so bloody clever, because you don't have to faff around trying to de-age anyone or anything like that, you just roll VT. It's like Babylon 5 does Back to the Future. What else have we got here? Various appearances from The One, of course, and Delenn opting to stabilise Sheridan, possibly because she can see he was hit hard by the energy discharge from the power core when they shifted to 2258. It's clever because it means we have two suited figures bouncing around, which means one can be given a stabiliser by Zathras, while Sinclair tries to reach out to Garibaldi outside the station, which logically had to be a failed effort because it already failed. We also, of course, get the explanation for why Sinclair wanted to keep Garibaldi out of things this time round. All this then culminates in the successful evacuation from Babylon 4 and Sinclair's decision to go back as informed by his future self from the past. I assume he told Delenn who he was going to become in his message to her, because Lennier seems to know how critical it is that he go back, even if the rest don't. Maybe why Sinclair wanted him to stay on the White Star so much. Zathras' explanation of the three as one is very touching. As much as he's a goofball, he's also a key part of the storytelling here. I guess this is Sinclair's Gethsemane moment, but we never see any suggestion that he isn't going to do it, nor is there any doubt in Zathras' mind that he's going to go back with him. You'd have half expected Marcus to volunteer for that detail, actually, thinking about it, but the Rangers still have a job to do in the present, of course. So, almost done, but not quite. At some point, Delenn's flash forward will happen, but we don't really have any way to date that, so that's just foreshadowing at this point. So, let's focus on Sheridan's lengthier adventure in 2277, give or take, perhaps. Logically, as this is a story told for 5 years in real time, time travel notwithstanding, we'll probably not see the resolution of this future snapshot, assuming it is a fixed point at all. But it's a completely unexpected, yet also foreshadowed departure from the obvious timeline, because we have seen G'Kar and Londo's final confrontation in Londo's dreams before now, and it's been foretold that Vera and Londo would be Emperor once the other was dead. And here Vera seems to have survived Londo, with Londo having become Emperor first, so that's a tick in the continuity box. You may remember the prophecy from Point of No Return, that one of the ways Londo might redeem himself was to surrender himself to what he feared most, knowing it would destroy him. Here he knew this was the time for his death, but he would still fear that, of course, yet he opened himself to it, so maybe this is what she meant. We also have the revelation that at this point Londo is not fully in control of his actions, because some actor has attached something symbiotic or perhaps parasitical to him that cannot be seen when it is conscious. He can only act independently when he is very drunk, and even then, his time is very limited. We don't know when this happened, of course, but logically this is very useful for Sheridan to know now, if he recalls it, although what action he might take or not take as a result is an open question, I suppose. As far as we know, he doesn't have it now, but what we didn't know is that in this timeline at least, Sheridan would win the war, or at least a war, but at great personal cost, and that he and Delenn would have a son, David. That's a pretty big deal, and it suggests that neither of them can now die in our timeline, if this is our timeline. Delenn suggests that nothing that has happened can be undone if the shadows are to be defeated. Yet just before he returns to 2258, she tells him not to go to Zahadum. It's not clear whether that conforms with what happened in that timeline, or whether she is in fact trying to change something regardless of the consequences. The tenderness between them in the cell is a lovely scene. Mira Furlan knocking it out of the park as usual. The lighting is also very clever, making you really focus just on the outlines of their faces and their words. What this flash forward does is reinforce Zathras' comment about the one story being the start of the next great story. Clearly the story will go on far beyond 5 years on the basis of this episode, and actually started many years before that too. This might be the story of the last of the Babylon stations, but the story is about the people that the station brings together, not just the station itself. So in that sense, it is just a jumping off point for the story as a whole. And this two-parter does exactly what it says on the tin. This is the war without end, in the past, present and future. We've just never thought about the future before now, even though we've had some clear indications of the past. Now, yes, the future may not be laid out in stone because Sheridan might be able to guide it now to a very limited degree, but we absolutely know that there is the potential for a future, a hope for a future, and you can see it coded for in the earliest episodes of the series. And that is why it's so worthwhile sticking with this show from the start, because it pays you back in spades, obviously. The funny thing is, these 2 episodes actually change absolutely nothing in a sense. They just give us some very clever payoffs for paying attention, but of course all it's actually doing is making sure that events that have already happened as we've seen them happen. Eh? Yeah, okay. Have a very Merry Christmas if that's your thing, and I'll slot one more in before the space year 2022.